He signed the order that sent captured soldiers to be executed instead of held as prisoners. He sat in the room while the invasion of a nation was planned as a deliberate war of extermination. And when Germany finally collapsed and American interrogators sat him down and asked him to account for it, he looked them in the eye and explained calmly why none of it was really his fault. His name was Alfred Jodl. For 12 years, he stood closer to Adolf Hitler than almost any general alive, shaping the orders that decided the fate of entire nations. And almost nobody outside the highest circles of the Third Reich knew his name. That was about to change forever. Before we get into exactly what he admitted, and some of it will genuinely disturb you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the War Files digs into the interrogation rooms and private confessions history tried to bury. To understand why Jodl's interrogation shook historians for decades, you first have to understand what he actually was inside the Nazi war machine. He served as chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, a position that sounds like paperwork until you realize what it actually entailed. Jodl was not a man who simply relayed orders. He took Hitler's raw, often unstable strategic instincts and turned them into executable military doctrine, standing at Hitler's side during briefings that decided the fate of entire nations. He was not a showman like Hermann Göring or a propagandist like Joseph Goebbels. He was something colder and far more dangerous, a consummate professional whose competence made the machinery of conquest run smoothly and quietly. Just results. He was born in Bavaria in 1890, the son of a military officer, and carried that pedigree with a soldier's pride. He fought in the First World War with distinction, survived the chaos of the Weimar years, and by the time the Nazis seized power, had already committed himself so completely to military service that ideology barely seemed necessary. The army was his country, orders were his scripture. Whether that amounted to complicity or simple obedience became the central question of everything that followed. When the end came, it came fast. By April 1945, the empire that had looked unstoppable a decade earlier was collapsing by the hour. Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin from the east. American and British forces had already crossed the Rhine. Deep underground in his bunker, Hitler was issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, raging at generals for failures that were entirely his own. Jodl was still there, still briefing, still pointing at maps showing German territory shrinking day by day, as if the ritual of planning could somehow hold back the collapse of an entire nation. On April 30th, Hitler shot himself. Within days, what remained of the Nazi leadership was scrambling to negotiate surrender. It fell to Alfred Jodl to travel to a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, and sign the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces. He did it on May 7th, 1945, and according to those in the room, he used the moment not for reflection, but to declare that the German people and the German military had endured more suffering than almost any nation in history. The Allied officers listening did not respond with sympathy. Within weeks, Jodl was under arrest. By summer, he was in Nuremberg, and the real reckoning was only beginning. The Nuremberg interrogations were nothing like the trial that followed. The trial was public theater with cameras, transcripts, and a global audience. The interrogations were raw, small rooms, tired officers, and a defendant who had spent a career mastering controlled composure. Jodl was questioned repeatedly through the fall and winter of 1945 into 1946. Much of it led by American intelligence officers who had spent months building a paper trail against him, signed orders, meeting minutes, operational directives, all pointing straight back to his own desk. What set Jodl apart from the other defendants was that he did not crack. Göring postured. Ribbentrop fell apart. Others wept, begged, deflected in a panic. Jodl argued calmly and methodically like a staff officer defending a battle plan, and that is exactly what made his testimony so revealing. Because the same cold logic that had made him invaluable to Hitler was now the very thing exposing him. One of the earliest breaking points came when interrogators pressed him about the so-called criminal orders, directives that shattered every accepted rule of warfare. The most infamous was the Commissar Order of 1941, which instructed German troops invading the Soviet Union to execute captured Soviet political officers on sight rather than hold them as prisoners of war, a blueprint for mass killing. Jodl did not deny knowing about it. His signature and those of officers under him were on the paperwork. Instead, he argued it had been militarily necessary, that the Soviet political system represented a threat unlike anything the German army had faced, and that in an existential war, ordinary rules had to bend. When interrogators pointed out the order had been drafted before the invasion even began, before any provocation, he shifted slightly, admitting that in hindsight it had been a mistake, though a tactical one, not a moral one. This became the pattern of the entire interrogation. Confronted with documented atrocities, Jodl almost never denied them outright. He reframed them as strategic miscalculations, mistakes of judgment, never of conscience. Interrogators pushed further into the Commando Order, Hitler's directive that captured Allied commandos be executed immediately regardless of their military status. Documents proved the order had passed directly through Jodl's office, and evidence showed it had been carried out. His answer here may be the single most revealing moment of the proceedings. He claimed he had personally objected to Hitler, warning the order was legally indefensible, but transmitted it anyway because his job was to execute the Führer's decisions, not block them. He was arguing he was too close to power to have been uninvolved, but too subordinate to bear responsibility for what that power decided. Powerful enough to know, powerless enough to be innocent. You cannot have it both ways, and the prosecution knew it. But something quieter was also happening in those sessions. Jodl was constructing an entire alternate history where the professional German military stood apart from the Nazi political machine, where soldiers obeyed with silent reluctance, and the crimes belonged to Hitler alone. It was a compelling story, and according to the evidence in front of him, almost entirely false. One of the strangest threads running through the transcripts is Jodl's relationship with Hitler, because even with Hitler dead and Germany in ashes, his feelings toward him had never fully resolved. At times, he spoke of Hitler's early strategic instincts with something close to admiration, recalling how Hitler had overruled his own generals on major decisions and turned out to be right, an atmosphere where disagreement became dangerous. But by 1943, and certainly 1944, Jodl acknowledged that something in Hitler had broken, describing briefings where Hitler refused real casualty numbers, ordered counterattacks with divisions that existed only on paper, and treated any suggestion of retreat as cowardice or treason. So interrogators asked the obvious question, knowing this, why did you not resign or speak out? Jodl's answer was chillingly honest. He said resignation would have accomplished nothing, that someone else would simply have taken his chair, and that by staying he believed he could soften the worst of it from the inside. It is the same argument made by loyal officials inside brutal systems throughout history, and historians still argue over it today. Restraint, or indispensable enablement dressed up as conscience. This is where the interrogations turn genuinely dark. Jodl admitted he had been present for nearly every major strategic decision since 1939, including the planning of Operation Barbarossa, and confirmed he had known from the earliest stages that German commanders were preparing for what internal documents literally called a war of annihilation against the Soviet state. Asked whether he understood the coming campaign would kill enormous numbers of civilians, his answer was careful, almost mechanical, that civilian casualties were an unavoidable feature of war, and his own focus had remained strictly operational. Then interrogators asked about the hunger plan, the deliberate German policy of starving occupied Soviet territories, projected to kill tens of millions. Jodl denied formal knowledge of it as an official directive, but could not deny sitting in the briefings or seeing the reports. In one exchange, rarely quoted, an officer lays the contradiction out plainly. You knew what was happening. You stayed at your post. You signed the orders that made it possible. So how do you reconcile that with calling yourself just a soldier following commands? Jodl's answer, stripped of its careful phrasing, amounted to this: I told myself it was the war. And then he moved on to the next question. If the Eastern Front reveals the scale of what Jodl enabled, Norway reveals the mechanism. In 1940, Jodl personally oversaw the operational planning for the invasion of Norway, a campaign he took genuine pride in, but the occupation that followed became a case study in organized terror. Norwegian civilians faced hostage-taking, arbitrary executions, and reprisal policies explicitly authorized at Jodl's command level. And when resistance fighters struck German forces, the retaliation often fell not on combatants, but on entire civilian communities. Presented with these orders, Jodl reached for the same defense again. Occupied territory required pacification, resistance had to be crushed, the measures were proportional. The documentation said otherwise. His entire moral framework had been built around one endlessly stretchable phrase: military necessity. He had not built a wall between himself and atrocity. He had simply given atrocity a different name and filed it under duty. As the interrogations moved toward trial, prosecutors turned to something bigger: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, a crime against peace under the newly created Nuremberg Charter. Jodl fought this charge harder than any other, claiming aggressive war had never been formally defined as a crime before the war started, and that punishing him now was retroactive justice. He even had his defense team compare Allied firebombing of German cities to the crimes he stood accused of, calling it a charge against the victors. The tribunal rejected it, but legal scholars have debated the retroactivity argument for decades since. Here is what makes Jodl's interrogation so unsettling. Across dozens of sessions, he almost never spoke about the victims. Not the Soviet civilians who died under policies his command helped design. Not the prisoners of war executed under orders his office processed. Not the Norwegian villagers shot in reprisal. There is exactly one moment where that distance broke. Late in one session, pressed about the catastrophic death rate of Soviet prisoners in German captivity, a rate so extreme it amounted to a deliberate policy of extermination, Jodl paused and said quietly that he had not fully grasped the scale of it at the time. The interrogator's own notes describe it as the only moment where Jodl appeared visibly shaken, a silence that tells you exactly how far he had learned to distance himself from the consequences of his own signature. The Nuremberg tribunal found Alfred Jodl guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946, alongside 9 other condemned men, meeting the end with the same composure he had carried through every interrogation, giving only his name and rank. In 1953, a West German court controversially overturned his conviction posthumously, ruling he had acted as a soldier under orders. The decision sparked outrage at home and abroad, and years later, legal authorities struck it down as flawed. So, what did Alfred Jodl's interrogation actually expose? On one level, the machinery itself. How orders born in one man's obsession moved through a chain of highly competent professionals who understood exactly what they were signing and did it anyway. No single dictator, however monstrous, could have run a continent spanning war of extermination alone. He needed men like Jodl, skilled, loyal, disciplined men who never once had to pull a trigger themselves. It revealed a man who had built his entire identity around duty so completely that duty had quietly replaced conscience. Jodl was not a fanatic or a sadist. He was a professional who convinced himself that his responsibility ended the moment an order was carried out, not when its consequences played out in the real world. And he served a genocidal state with such technical skill that he became functionally essential to its crimes. This is precisely the myth Nuremberg was built to dismantle, that a uniform can absolve a man. That rank is a moral shield, that someone can stand at the center of history's worst atrocities and still say, "In good conscience, I was just doing my job." What makes Jodl's testimony so disturbing is that he was not performing. He had been telling himself this exact story for over a decade before the Allies ever sat him down, reaching the same verdict every time, that he was a soldier, that soldiers obey, and that the weight of what they obey belongs to someone else. History disagreed. If this pulled you in, you know what to do. Subscribe to the War Files and ring that bell, because next time we are stepping into another room history tried to forget. We will see you there.